Okay, so here's the last chapter where we're going to go ahead and look at some um, actual examples of how management has been done. So we can kind of send you off on a note of having some background experience, I guess, in how to do this kind of stuff. Maybe you'll end up with some of your own ideas about what was good and what was bad about those things. But before we do that, I just want to remind you here, please, if you get a chance, go ahead and do the course evaluation. I know the tail end of this course was kind of squirrely with the whole COVID thing. But let me know if you liked the course, what you didn't like about it, all that kind of stuff. Please do it. It's good for me. I like them. So anyway, where we're going here then, right, again, I'm just going to leave this up here just for a second. We'll talk about both cases where we tried to increase populations and places where we're trying to reduce them. Okay, this is not necessarily predator versus prey populations or game populations. It's going to be a little bit of both. And then kind of what are some future challenges for us. Okay, so population management, again here, this the idea that we need to increase or decrease, or in some cases kind of maintain levels of animals in the world, right? And this is stuff that we've talked about quite a bit, right? We spent way back in the very first course, right? We spent a fair amount of time looking at the history of this stuff. And a lot of the management that we've been talking about has kind of been in this maintain population size stuff, right? So when we talk about K, right, carrying capacity, that's been a lot of the active management that we've talked about. With deer, right, we want to keep them a little below K, with quail a little below K, stuff like that. But in some cases, we've got big problems, right? We've got species that we've hunted to almost extinction, or for whatever reason are not in the numbers we need them to be or want them to be, or the opposite here, where there's just too much of something and we need to kind of get those numbers back down to a healthy ecosystem kind of level. So we're going to start here then with this, wow, that's terrible, with this first one here, the one we're going to try to increase those populations with a couple of different examples. So the first example we'll talk about here, gray wolves. Now, as you might imagine, the kind of the historical gray wolf relationship with people has been that we shot them. And we've talked a little bit about that before, right, with predator management and the idea that we always thought killing predators would lead to good things. As it turns out, not necessarily true. And I don't want to rehash all of that. Long story short, right, we were wrong. We were trying to bring them back to places they were historically. Okay. So really the story here with gray wolves has been trying to bring them back into particularly Yellowstone National Park, but in kind of a lot of those areas, particularly once we got the Endangered Species Act, gray wolf populations were low enough that they actually became protected. And that was the source of a lot of the initial funding for the repopulation of gray wolves, what we called the Rocky Mountain Wolf Recovery Plan. That ended in 1987. And the idea was that we were going to try to take wolves from places that we knew that they were and relocate them in hopes that they would generate a sufficient breeding population that they would then kind of increase on their own. It set into place a lot of things like governing when you were allowed to shoot wolves. So private landowners were still allowed to shoot wolves on their property if they could demonstrate that they were actively killing livestock. That has been kind of a little wiggly, right? Ranchers, as you know from previous discussions, really don't like wolves in general. And so they tend to shoot wolves anyway. With the idea that, yeah, they were definitely killing my cows. It is what it is. One of the issues that came out of this, though, is that we began to see wolf populations rise, and then they began to, because they're animals and they don't care about borders, they began to leave the places that we were trying to bring them back into. We've got some legal problems with that. It was an interesting case, and kind of an ongoing, continuing thing. We're actually successful at the point, we've been almost 20 years now where wolves are no longer endangered. They are threatened in most places. In some cases, they were brought off threatened, but as we saw before, they were very, very quickly hunted to the point where they were, again, brought back down to threatened. So they are still, as of 2020, protected. They're threatened. But they are no longer endangered. So kind of a quasi success story for us here. One of the ecological things reasons we want to bring wolves back, right? We talked about a little bit before, and this is an example we'll come back, we'll talk about if you take ecology with me. Wolves are, in their ecosystem, actually really, really important in terms of controlling populations of basically everything else in the ecosystem. They exhibit what's called top-down control. And so even down to the point of tree species, right, in these places, by culling deer, by sort of preventing deer from occupying certain places because of the threat of being eaten by a wolf, we get different tree species that are present or not present, which has, again, ramifications for all the other animals that might try to utilize those resources. So again, top-down control here, having wolves or not changes the entire ecosystem within them. So fairly important context for us to have a reason for why we're trying to do this. Our second example here, the red cockaded woodpecker, is something we haven't talked about. They're on here because of logging, basically. The longleaf pine in the southeastern US is basically their habitat, and we've cut down almost 100% of them. We're at now somewhere a little bit less than 1% of the original longleaf pine forest remaining. And so because they lost their habitat, we more or less have lost almost all the red cockaded woodpeckers. They're endangered. They were on track for extinction for decades. Really only beginning in the 90s, we saw some sort of resurgence, a little bit of success. We're still endangered. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're seeing breeding populations increase. Early 90s, there were less than 5,000 breeding clusters. Early 2000s, there were a little over 6,000. I don't have more recent numbers on those, but so the populations are beginning to increase a little bit. Things that we're doing here, really two big things that have helped us out a little bit. We've put in, so one of the things we talked about with habitat and habitat improvement, we talked about with small mammals is giving them mailboxes so they have places to kind of tuck into and hide. Here we're doing what's called cavity provisioning. We're basically, the idea here is that they brood and they nest in cavities in trees, right? These longleaf pines. But the longleaf pine are gone. So we're putting in artificial bird boxes that mimic the cavities in trees that they would have occupied. And by providing these artificial cavities, by these artificial bird boxes, we're giving them habitat, right? The other thing that we're doing here is something that we've done with gray wolves, and we've talked about before, this notion of translocation. We're taking them from places that there are a bunch of them and we're moving them into places where we've kind of made an attempt to restore the habitat, or we've put in a lot of these artificial cavities or anything like that. We're giving them, we're trying to artificially kind of expand their range a little bit, right? So some successes here for sure. Finally, the last of our examples here of increasing populations, these are the piping plovers. These are shorebirds. You've probably seen them around. They live along the Atlantic coast. So if you ever go, you go out to New Jersey or the Atlantic coast out here, or you go to Myrtle Beach, you'll see them in Myrtle Beach. All the way down through North Carolina. We see them a lot. I'm from Michigan, so I'm really used to seeing them on the shores of the Great Lakes. I shouldn't say really used to seeing them. They're not not particularly common anymore, but I'm used to seeing them in the Great Lakes. And then, strangely enough, kind of along the Canadian border, like in Montana and the Dakotas, we see them a lot there as well. They are really susceptible to habitat loss. They have a very specific place that they tend to live. And we also tend to like to live in those places. And so we tend to develop them and basically kick them out, right? So we're driving them basically to extinction. How are we trying to solve this? Management here for us has been basically around trying to set up artificial or restore breeding habitat. This is our number one goal here, right? And the idea behind this is that if we can create more breeding habitat, if we can make the breeding habitat more suitable, I know we've talked about suitable and unsuitable, but we can make it better for them. We can increase their numbers every year, and that's going to be our mechanism for trying to increase their species numbers. In particular here, not only adding some, but we're trying to reduce predation at that breeding habitat. So predator control, this is one of those cases where predator control, we are using it, right? We are out there trying to, for the 2 weeks in the surrounding period of their breeding season, especially, we're trying to remove predators from the area so that they can survive, they can mate, they can lay their eggs, the eggs can hatch, everybody's happy. Okay. Something that we've tried to do that has been wildly unpopular, right? Remember, these guys live on the beach, right? And so closing beaches during certain times of the year, during nesting seasons, something that we do, and you will often, particularly if you go to Myrtle Beach for spring break or whatever, you will oftentimes, depending on the time of year, you will see sections of beaches roped off. This is to protect their breeding habitat. Hugely unpopular because humans are stupid and greedy, and so you will often see people trying to trespass in those areas or go in and do a Instagram dance or something in front of, I don't know what people do, but it's a problem, right? So this is closing beaches or cordoning off beaches is wildly unpopular, but extremely important for us in terms of trying to maintain or grow plover populations. If you can't do it, they're out of luck. For sustenance here, right? Things like moose, meese, right? No, moose, both singular and plural here, which is kind of a fun word. Waterfowl, talk about prairie dogs in a little bit here. Numbers that we're happy with, right? We don't want them too much bigger. We don't want them too much smaller. We kind of like to keep them where they're at. For moose here, you know, moose, they're big. They're big and they're scary as hell. I don't know if you've ever been in close proximity to a moose before. They are absolutely terrifying because they're huge. I don't think I can express to you how big they are. And they tend to live in some pretty remote, weird places, which is good for them and good for us both. But that makes it a little bit hard for us to kind of work for them because they live in remote places, right? So what we're stuck with doing, right, is basically surveys of things from the air in particular. We do a lot of air surveys to try to see maybe moose counts. One of the issues that we've got with moose in particular is that because they tend to live in these remote areas, there's not a lot of human interaction with the plant life. But the problem that we've got is trying to understand how large of a population can we expect a moose, or how much moose population can we expect a given area to support. And that's a little bit tricky because, again, you can't just go marching around moose territory unless you really want to get run over by a moose, right? So understanding a lot of that has been kind of the big issue for us. What we're doing in terms of management techniques then is forest management, right? We're trying to manage for cover, we're trying to manage for food, we're trying to manage for things. We're using things like timber harvesting, part of it. Fire, another example. We're going to use fire. To try to create habitat. We also do some protective things for their habitat. One of the things that we worry about, they have a lot of seasonal needs. So overstory. If you've ever been in the woods in the winter, you'll note that at the sort of the denser forest, there's no snow on the ground, right? And because there's no snow on the ground, the plants that are still small and leafy and growing in those times are accessible. That's really, really important for mammals in general, but for moose in particular, that's a lot of their overwinter food source. Being able to find seeds and nuts and things on the ground, being able to find the few remaining green plants and stuff like that. And they can't do that if there's snow cover. So we need to manage for areas where there's going to be enough overstory, right? Enough leaf cover, enough branch cover, prevent heavy snows from getting in. One of the issues with moose, they have sodium deficiency. So we need to manage for them having licks, things like that. One place they get a lot of their sodium is from aquatic plants. So we need to make sure that there's wetlands available to them. They can eat those aquatic plants. Those are very, very salty. If you've never eaten an aquatic plant, you should try a bite of one sometime. Make sure it's not poisonous. But they're salty. They're really, really, really salty. Which is kind of an interesting thing. For duck, for geese, for other things, one of our big issues, of course, is that these are migratory. Okay, now this makes life a little bit easy for us because we only have to manage for them part of the year, and we only have to manage for part of their needs, right? But we need to understand what those needs are going to be. And for us, in this kind of part of the world, a lot of their needs are going to be around breeding, right? Giving them breeding territory. And honestly, a lot of that is just square hectareage of open water, right? Making sure there's lots and lots of open space for them to have that. Like with moose, okay, for these guys, a big part of the management is hunting as well. Wow, just forget about all that. Hunting, right? Issuing licenses for compensatory mortality is a big thing for us. Okay? So knowing how many moose there are, knowing how many moose the habitat can logically support, same thing with duck, okay, or goose, or any of the other waterfowl that you might be hunting. Knowing how many licenses to issue for a sustainable population is a big part of the management behind that. An example of one that we don't really hunt, just in general, and also because they are now also protected. I don't know if they still are protected anymore, with the lifting of restrictions on the Endangered Species Act. Prairie dogs. Now, prairie dogs are complicated because prairie dogs spread, spread bubonic plague and hantavirus. So they are extremely potentially dangerous to human populations. So they're really no different than really any rodent are, honestly. You can get both of these things from any rodent: rats, mice, field mice, whatever. One of the things that we talk about these with prairie dogs in particular, however, is that prairie dogs are extremely susceptible to these things. So while they might pass them to human populations, they are also more likely to die out completely in an area because of them. Bubonic plague wipes out colonies every 3 or 4 years or something, depending on where you're at. Historically, we hunted them. Were hunted not for sport, not for meat, but they were hunted to wipe them out of the Great Plains so that we could farm. And as a result, a lot of, particularly actually ranching, honestly. So one of the issues with prairie dog, I'm going to pull up a blank screen here. One of the issues with prairie dogs, of course, is that they burrow. Right? They have a little burrow like this, right, that they live in. And if you are a rancher and your horse is walking along, right, and puts their foot in that burrow, you now have a horse or a cattle with a broken leg. And what do you do with a horse or a cattle that has a broken leg? You shoot it, because they do not survive those wounds. They do not heal. You do not see horses recovering from broken legs and things like that. So the movement to get rid of prairie dogs was largely built around ranching and farming, rather than any desire to mount a prairie dog on your wall or to put one in your furnace, right? Oh, skipped. There we go. Okay. So they're kind of an interesting scenario where we want to, I don't know why it's going backwards, where we want to kind of try to manage for certain population sizes, but not particularly large ones. Reducing populations, this one we're going to see quite a lot, and increasingly so in modern times. Feral hogs, okay, wild boar. They are huge, they are dangerous, they are hard to kill, and they are encroaching on human settlements. They are surprisingly smart. They can reproduce a couple times a year, so they can have 2 litters sometimes in a year. They are incredibly damaging to natural resources, to farming, to livestock, to human health and safety, because they'll eat anything and they will tear up anything to get what they want. So from a management context, okay, primarily what we're doing here is hunting. A lot of states are implementing one or several boar or feral hog hunting seasons. They're often issuing, rather than licenses, they're issuing bounties for them. There are non-lethal, so we talk about exclusive fencing. This isn't like you have some exclusive version of something that's special. This is to exclude. So exclusive fencing here means fencing that isn't meant to keep them out. There's been some success with that, but frankly, we just got to get rid of them. You know, I'm not the sort of person that really advocates just shooting the shit out of things, but there's really no other good solution here. Aerial hunting, night hunting. One of the cases where we see suppressed, silence is the wrong word, right? But suppressed firearms for hunting feral swine, because you can kill a whole bunch of them in one go if you have a suppressed weapon. Basically, this is our best tool for getting rid of these guys. And then, of course, deer. You know, obviously, we often think about deer as a resource for hunting, particularly here in well, most places, honestly. But there are places where deer are that we don't hunt, right? Cities in particular, right? So if you go down to Pittsburgh, you can't just walk down Forbes Avenue with a gun, right, and shoot deer. It just, you can't do it. So for those kinds of situations, the hunting is not a solution. And so trying to remove them from those places, from those sorts of urban environments, it's not easy, right? Our biggest successes in those urban landscapes, I know I just said they don't work for swine. They don't. Fencing is a big one. Repellents. So particularly we think about odor, predator urine, things like that. Trapping and relocation. Okay. In urban settings, those are really your big three. Tried birth control, limited success. Okay, to try to just make sure there's not a next generation, right? And that works sometimes, but it's, if you have a small population and you know that they're not migrating in and out, then it works great. If you have a big population, it's too expensive. You just can't do it, right? Just bafflingly expensive. In urban landscapes, one thing that we can do, I'm going to draw a line here. One thing we can do is professional hunting. So you can be hired on as a sharpshooter and take out individuals within an area. You have to go through a lot of training to do this, but if done properly, it's safe, humane, and it solves the problem. But it's not something that you can do everywhere. That's what we'll talk about here. I guess we will talk about this, guys. I kind of debate whether we do this or not. Cowbirds are called parasites. They are brood nest parasites. They lay their eggs in the nests of other birds, and they roll the other eggs out of the nest. Basically what happens is they trick the parents into raising their offspring. normally we wouldn't care, but if we're trying to manage for those birds, the eggs that are rolled out of those nests don't survive. And so that can be really detrimental to the populations of the birds being parasitized. Okay. So in some places, these cowbirds are sufficiently damaging to populations. We go out and we try to manage them, manage against them. We can do a couple of things. We can do increase host breeding habitat. Okay. So we can manage not sort of indirectly these cowbirds. There's only so many cowbirds, right? So if we give more breeding habitat, we have more breeding populations of the host, we have more offspring. We can kind of offset the loss from this parasitism. Something that we can do, right? But that requires that we have access to a lot of land that we can manage, which is not always something that we can do. And sometimes, you know, we talk about this a lot. Is one of our common management tools for that, and that's not really always something that we can do. Obviously, hunting and trapping cowbirds is something that we can do. We do a fair amount, and one fairly easy thing that we can do is we can simply remove. This is easier than it sounds. Remove cowbird eggs. And destroy them. Easy peasy, right? Honestly, this one gets the gold star. This is the easiest one to do, the most effective, most cost effective. It's all of those things. Okay, so last slide of the course, believe it or not. Looking forward, you know, a lot of these cases, as we say with gray wolves or with some of these other things, we might begin to transition from increasing populations to maintaining populations. Same deal with some of the ones we're trying to get rid of, right? We're trying to reduce population sizes. Some of that's going to get moved into the maintaining population sizes. Some of these maintaining ones are going to, because of things like climate change, because of anthropogenic activities, we're moving in their territory, creating more farms, whatever else. Some of the things we're maintaining might move into the need to increase. Okay, so like with everything that we've been doing, everything we've been talking about, it's adaptive. You know, there's all kinds of changes coming, changes we can't foresee, changes we can foresee, all kinds of new challenges, some of the same old challenges. It's going to be interesting, right? And you are going to need to be willing to be flexible with how you approach things. You're going to need to kind of continuously reevaluate your processes, reevaluate your own preconceived notions, be willing to educate stakeholders in changing demographics, changing environmental conditions. I hesitate to say it'll be fun. I don't think it will be, but it will be a challenge, and it will be up to you guys really to make that happen. So thank you for sticking with us through the whole COVID-19 semester thing going on. I will put up the exam soon. You'll have a couple of days to do it, as always. Again, please remember to do the course evaluation, and I will see you guys next year.